Hello again. In this part 2 video of chapter 21, I will go over some of the effects of British rule in India. And this is a famous picture of the Gateway to India. It was built by the British to commemorate the visit of King George V and Queen Mary in 1911. And it's in the harbor of Mumbai. That's India's greatest port city. And for thousands of British citizens arriving in India, the Gateway was their first view of their new home and a symbol of the power and the majesty of the British Raj. But before we go any further, something I neglected to talk about in part 1, just briefly mentioned it, I think, was this idea of assimilation or association. And the colonialists, both English and French, struggled with this policy. The French were inclined to use assimilation, which implied an effort to transform colonial societies in their own image. I think I mentioned the fact that they wanted to make the colonists into little French men and women. This was their preferred style of rule, along with ruling directly in terms of how they're going to socialize them. The idea of assimilation was favored by the French. And the English are also going to struggle with this idea on top of the association type of socialization where you work with local elites while leaving local traditions alone. And both the English and the French struggle with this type of policy. But back to India, by 1800s, the Mughals, had been reduced by British military power to a shadow of its former greatness. During the next decades, the British consolidated their control over the Indian subcontinent. Some territories were taken over directly by the East India Company and later the British Crown. Others were ruled indirectly through the local Maharajas and Rajas. Not all the effects of British rule were bad. British governance over the subcontinent brought order and stability to a society that had been rent by civil war. With the decline of the Mughal Empire, those were chaotic years in the late 1700s. By the early 19th century, British control had led to a relatively honest and efficient government that in many respects operated to the benefit of the average Indian. British rule also brought an end to some of the more inhumane aspects of Indian tradition. The practice of sati was outlawed, and widows were legally permitted to remarry, as you'll recall. Sati was where a widow would throw herself on the funeral pyre, because Hindus like to use cremation at the end of life. The widow was expected to end her life too by throwing herself on the fire. Not very nice. The British also attempted to put an end to the endemic brigandage known as the Thuggee, which gave rise to the English word thugs, who had plagued travelers in India since time immemorial. Railroads, the telegraph, and postal service were introduced to India shortly after they appeared in Great Britain. So there were infrastructure improvements made. Law and order was a stabilizing influence. But the Indian people paid a high price for the peace and stability brought by the British Raj, from the Indian Raja or Prince. As a member of the Supreme Council of India in the early 1830s, Thomas Babington Macaulay drew up an educational policy for Britain's Indian subjects. In his Minute on Education, he considered the claims of English and various local languages to become the vehicle for educational training, and he decided in favor of the former. If Indian elites were taught about Western civilization, he argued, they would, quote, form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect, unquote. Later, Macaulay became a prominent historian, and the debate over the relative benefits of English and the various Indian languages continues today in the subcontinent. This is sometimes favored by certain Indian elites as a way of trying to cut across the multiple languages that are spoken on the Sun continent. Sometimes they favor going back to using English as a universal language in India. Educated Indians were trained in the Anglo-Indian school system for a career in the civil service, like Jawaharlal Nehru. Later on, he will become one of the early prime ministers of the country, one of the disciples of Gandhi and the practices of nonviolence. Nehru was English educated. And they also offered these educational benefits to Eurasians born to mixed marriages, and they often imitated the behavior and dress of their rulers, speaking English, eating Western food, and taking up European leisure activities like lawn tennis or playing golf or cricket. Ends up becoming a very, very popular sport to this day in India. But many rightfully wondered where their true cultural loyalties then lay. Great Britain made few efforts during the 19th century to bring democratic institutions or values to the subcontinent. As one senior political figure remarked in Parliament in 1898, democratic institutions, quote, can no more be carried to India by Englishmen than they can carry ice in their luggage, unquote. They also did little to bring modern science and technology to India, except in the manufacturing of textiles, which is why Gandhi later on will recommend to the subcontinent and the mass millions of people who live there that they engage in spinning and weaving once again, as they did before the Industrial Revolution, before the introduction of British finished textiles, clothing items that were much cheaper and more easily available than making clothes for themselves. He believed that they should go back to the old practices. Rope making was also a limited manufacturing concern that was introduced. But for the most part, they want India to be a market for finished British goods. Foreign rule also had a psychological effect on the Indian people. Although many British colonial officials sincerely tried to improve the lot of the people under their charge, British arrogance and contempt for native traditions cut deeply into the pride of many Indians, especially those of the higher caste, the Brahmins, who were accustomed to a position of superior status in India. So if they're not one of these ruling officials, some of them were, many of them were not, and then they had no higher status than any other Indian. And here's a map of the areas that by the end of the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857, when direct rule is practiced in many of these areas. The yellowish areas will be administered by Indians, mainly up in the north here and also in Hyderabad. And these lighter color areas, such as the rest of Hyderabad and Rajputana, will be ruled by Indian administration. There is a Portuguese enclave still in Goa, which was there since the early 1500s after the voyages of Vasco da Gama, as you'll recall from World Civ I. Da Gama was the first to go all the way around the Horn of Africa, and he goes all the way to India. Diaz had stopped and turned around, Bartholomew Diaz. And the Portuguese are still there. And there is a very small French enclave right here, and there's also one at the tip of Ceylon, which is today Sri Lanka. After the 7 Years' War, the French presence in India from 1763 becomes less and less and less, and that's all that's left, just that little bit area there. These orange-colored areas are Hindu provinces, whereas these yellower-colored, goldish colors are mostly Muslim provinces. And these slashed areas are home to the Sikh population, SIKH, which was the blending religion of Muslim or Islamic faith and Hindu faith. The Sikhs will attempt to combine both religions. And that is about it for the effects of British rule in India.